The esports industry is currently at a crossroads. The past several years have witnessed millions of dollars pumped into an industry that previously had to plead their case for legitimacy to any ear that would spare a listen. Previously relying on G Fuel and prayers, team organizations competing within esports saw $1 million from outside funding in 2016, increasing to $65 million in 2017, and then a whopping $193 million in 2018. 56% of that from venture capital, with the rest coming from family office and private equity sources. Some more famous investments that made headlines back then include the Madison Square Garden Company's purchase of CounterLogic Gaming and the founding of Golden Guardians by a Golden State Warriors-backed ownership group. If you're a football fan, maybe you heard about Dallas Cowboys owner Jerry Jones purchasing Complexity, or Patriots owner Robert Kraft and Rams owner Stan Kroenke starting up their own Overwatch teams. There is no shortage of new names putting big dollars into esports. Over the next 5 years, prolific orgs such as Fnatic, Cloud9, Team Liquid, Misfits, and many more have continued to see tens of millions of dollars flow in through subsequent investment rounds. Many teams are competing in publishers' first-party competitive structures, such as Riot's League Championship Series and Valorant Champions Tour, Activision Blizzard's Overwatch League and Call of Duty League, and Valve's The International, and more. A few of these, such as LCS and OWL, are franchise leagues, requiring millions of dollars to buy in. And seemingly for good reason, as publishers running these leagues are aiming to emphasize a high level of production, quality, and support for top levels of play revolving around their games. After all, hundreds of thousands or even millions of people will be watching on Twitch or YouTube, or overseas on Bilibili and Huya. Some of these team organizations participating in these leagues will also field teams or players in entirely separate games, expanding and establishing their presence in the industry. This in turn grows the ecosystem and increases the profile of those games. A rising tide lifts all boats, as they say. So with countless eyes and fandom surrounding these events, teams, and players, creating a whirlwind of advertising, promotion, merchandising, ticketing, you name it, it makes sense on paper why this investment is happening. But in reality, the vast majority of these team organizations are not profitable. As this becomes more and more evident, investors are pulling out, taking the starry-eyed vision of the future with them. With so many team organizations fielding teams in multiple games, trouble for one sometimes means trouble for all. The first few months of 2023 have seen a blitz of bad news, almost mirroring the auspicious articles 5 years before. 100 Thieves, which fields teams in multiple games and even won the LCS 2021 championship, started the new year off right by laying off 30 employees. That previously mentioned Stan Kroenke-owned Overwatch team, it began fielding teams in Apex Legends, Valorant, and Call of Duty, but it also just laid off 100 of its employees, with its franchise slots in OWL and CDL facing either sale or closure. CLG announced it was laying off all of its employees, with the exception of its LCS staff and players, while Madison Square Garden sold the remains of the team to NRG. Speaking of selling, Misfits Gaming sold their franchise slot in the LEC, Riot's regional European LOL league, at the end of the 2022 season as they shift their focus towards working with content creators. Back across the pond, TSM's future in the LCS remains uncertain amid rumors they are looking to cut back the games they compete in. Perhaps the most notable example of a team organization's fortunes turning sour is FaZe Clan, which did what no other org would fathom and went public on the stock market back in 2022. Less than a year later and 20% of its workforce smaller, FaZe has been served a notice of delisting by NASDAQ after its stock price tumbled lower than $1. But why haven't teams been able to turn a profit? And why is this all coming to a head now? The single largest revenue source for teams has always been advertising sponsorships, with it accounting for 63% of total revenue globally in 2022. Historically, meaning last several years, this has never been enough to put teams in the black and give their investors their ROI and hope for stability. That's okay as long as team organizations are being treated as startups that are figuring out their business model as they mature. But meaningful revenue sources outside of sponsorships have yet to be found, and ads are no longer cutting it. Recently, global revenue and revenue per fan has missed expectations, and sponsors, notably crypto exchanges, have collapsed or shrunk. Plus, a looming general recession would decrease the value of advertising and subsequently sponsorship deals, the primary revenue source for teams. Inquiring even deeper, Why does the industry have an over-reliance on one type of revenue? Why haven't other revenue streams been figured out? Before we can answer any of these questions, we need to examine a historical analog that serves to contrast the bleak impasse esports is currently sitting in. American football. But not that American football. The other one. I won't go into full detail on the long history of the game, but our modern idea of it only really started to form in the early 1900s. Over the course of multiple decades of competing parties in the space, the basis for the rules and practices were determined, with a lot of them being kickstarted by this guy. The National Football League was founded under the original name American Professional Football Association in 1920, but it wasn't until the late 1950s that the NFL really started to pop off. Other investors really wanted to get in on this hot league with expansion teams, but many of the team owners at the time, as well as NFL Commissioner Bert Bell, weren't really going for that. So one of these investors, Lamar Hunt, son of a rich oil baron, gets an idea to start a new league. So over the course of a few months in early 1959, he manages to gather enough investors for his new league to announce the American Football League, or AFL, that summer. The next decade of the game is defined by the ensuing rivalry between the AFL and the NFL, both on and off the field. The NFL successfully managed to coax away some investors from the AFL. The AFL was able to sign some players away from the NFL. The AFL had to innovate on its broadcast, more on this later, and the rules of the game, with the use of the two-point conversion. This new league grew and grew until it forced the more established NFL to take it seriously as a competitor. And in 1966, a group of NFL team owners approached the AFL to begin a merger of the two leagues, which completed in 1970. Eventually, the AFL proved its legitimacy in the eyes of the American public. And in the third and fourth AFL-NFL championship games, read Super Bowls 3 and 4, the team representing the AFL beat the team representing the NFL. The bottom line is, when met with an obstacle in the form of the near-monopolistic National Football League, the creators of the American Football League had the option of using their money, connections, and resources to form a meaningful competitor, and they did so. In response, the NFL had to change, and it created a net positive for the industry and for what is now the most popular sport in America. Returning to the modern day, how does this AFL-NFL situation relate to what is happening in the esports industry? The esports industry as a whole can actually be broken down into smaller sub-industries based on game. League of Legends esports can be considered a different industry than Overwatch or CSGO esports, in the same way football is different from baseball or basketball. But crucially, the big difference between esports and traditional sports is that no one owns the game of football, but a publisher owns the game of League of Legends. Because of this, publishers have the option of control to mold their esports industry how they see fit. Their game is their intellectual property, and their control is granted to them by US copyright law. What ends up happening is that publishers exercise this option of control in different ways. The typical example of how most publishers approach esports can be seen with companies like Riot, Activision Blizzard, Psyonix, Ubisoft, and many others. They all run first-party competitive structures for their games and handle them how they see fit, sometimes working with third-party event coordinators and production companies to make them happen. These competitions will vary in format, schedule, and scale based on the priorities of the publisher running them. In the previously mentioned cases of ABC and Riot, they host franchise leagues. By and large, these first-party competitive structures end up being the de facto largest and most prolific within their respective esports scenes, with players of the highest skill level participating. But publishers also vary in how much they choose to control or support competitions that are run by third-party event coordinators. Some publishers may offer ways for event coordinators to acquire a license to legally operate and broadcast their competitions, while others may offer nothing. When a license is acquired, they can be restrictive in what the event coordinator can do. As an example, a custom license from ABC limits a competition in the number of teams that can enter, the amount and kind of sponsorships that can be pursued, the size of the prize pool, the design of the event's logo, and the name of the event itself, and more. It gets to a point that the event coordinators can never really hope to run a competition anywhere near the same scale as anything run by the publisher. In addition, publishers may also impose limitations on how the players that compete in their first-party competitions can compete in any third-party events, adding further obstacles. The success of third-party competitive structures is thus capped. If an event coordinator violates any of the terms of the license, they risk being shut down by the publisher. This happened early last year when Riot shut down amateur League of Legends tournaments in Europe for violating license guidelines, even though the violations had been happening for months with no qualms from the parties involved. Event coordinators continue on despite the headache, because if they forgo a license altogether, they are putting their competition at an even greater risk of being shut down than they otherwise would be. Perhaps we should be grateful some publishers give out licenses at all. Nintendo, as an extreme example, is infamous for shutting down competitive tournaments for games in their Super Smash Bros. Franchise run by third-party event coordinators, usually for little to no reason or on flimsy pretext. At the same time, they seldom host Super Smash Bros. Tournaments of their own, and when they do, they tend to be on a lesser scale than the tournaments they have shut down. The generally stingy attitude that Nintendo has conveyed through their actions indicates they probably would prefer it if competitive Super Smash Bros. Tournaments didn't happen at all. Valve is another non-typical example. They can be seen as having a laissez-faire approach towards the esports scene surrounding their games, mainly Dota 2 and Counter-Strike Global Offensive. In Dota 2 esports, Valve has a direct hand in the running of the International, the annual global championship tournament. While Valve still determines the overall competitive structure and schedule that feeds into TI, they instead opt for sponsoring the third-party event coordinators that run the regional leagues and the 3 annual majors rather than running those events themselves. Valve is even more hands-off with CSGO, running no tournaments of their own and only sponsoring a couple majors in their preceding qualifiers each year. In contrast to its peers, Valve rarely makes moves to shut down or limit tournaments based on perceived competition to their own. With CSGO in particular, this has led to a scene with robust third-party event coordinators who are able to grow and change their competitive structures and practices as needed, while offering an alternative to any competitions that are Valve-sponsored. The most notable example of this is ESL and its eponymous Pro League and Pro Tour, the only third-party franchise league in the esports industry. A plethora of third-party tournaments, however, can mean a lack of standardized rules and regulations across the scene, or a confusing landscape and schedule overall. This restraint in how much Valve controls their esports scene is an active choice that they are making. The publisher could choose to insert themselves more, and they have. In 2015, they famously banned a team of players who were found to have thrown a game for the purpose of match fixing. It took Valve a whole year to later clarify that it was a lifetime ban after community uncertainty following the ruling, with little to no communication with the parties involved. There also seemed to be little consideration for the fact that this was the first time Valve had issued a ban ruling for match fixing in CSGO esports, nor for the fact that one of the banned players was underage at the time. Additionally, the competition the match fixing took place in was not Valve sponsored. All of these things contributed to an uncertainty around how Valve would involve itself in CSGO esports going forward. Over the years, what all of these actions have collectively done is create a paradigm where the publishers are seen as the curators and arbiters of their industries. The attitude of a given publisher towards their game's esports scene determines if a scene can survive and how it can thrive, and their decisions are final. So if a hypothetical League of Legends Lamar Hunt didn't like how Riot was running LCS, he couldn't start up a league of his own that could grow and eventually rival the LCS without risk of it being shut down without recourse if Riot felt threatened enough by it. But more crucially for our original question, if team owners who bought into a franchise league were disgruntled with how the league was handling, say, inking sponsorship deals or broadcast deals, then their bargaining power within the league would be greatly diminished, especially considering they couldn't form a new league with more sustainable practices. Which brings us back to the AFL-NFL standoff of the 60s. The AFL actually introduced quite a lot of things that have now become standard, such as including names on the backs of jerseys, cutting the broadcast directly from a shot of the punter to a shot of the receiver, and incorporating the sounds of the game into the broadcast. But how the broadcast itself came to be is perhaps the most innovative. In June of 1960, the nascent AFL signed a national TV contract with ABC Network to broadcast their games in return for $8.5 million over 5 years, increasing if certain advertising targets were met. Each team would receive around $170,000 a year. In other words, around 80% of the money made from the deal went to the teams. On top of the substantial split, what really set this deal apart at the time was that it was for a national broadcast, where every team had an equal share of the money made from the contract. This made sure that during the budding years of the league, teams had some level of income to fall back on with a baseline level of competitiveness to build from. This idea was so cool and novel that the NFL decided to do the same thing just a year later, signing a contract with CBS for $4.65 million a year over 2 years. However, the more dominant NFL, already under scrutiny from the US government for potentially being a monopoly, had their deal struck down in July 1961 by a federal court as a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was because the NFL shifted from their previous policy in which teams sold their broadcast rights individually within their regions to the new model where every team collectively pooled their broadcast rights to sell them on a national scale while agreeing not to sell them on a regional scale. However, the NFL managed to successfully lobby Congress for an exemption. And in September, the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961 was passed and signed into law. The SBA allows leagues in any of the big 4 professional team sports in North America, meaning football, baseball, basketball, and hockey, to collectively pool and sell their team's broadcast rights together. The importance of this change in practice and the passage of this law cannot be understated. The NFL still follows this collective model to this day. So with the economic and cultural juggernaut the NFL and the Super Bowl have become, TV deals are the main source of revenue for teams. Currently, the NFL has various deals with traditional broadcasters such as CBS, ESPN and ABC Network, Fox, and NBC, as well as newer online platforms such as Amazon and YouTube, totaling an estimated $100 billion through the 2033 season. Around $11.1 billion was generated by the league during the 2021 to 2022 season, with each team receiving $309 million during the fiscal year ending in March 2021. This is a huge chunk of change. As an example, to put in perspective how important this source of revenue is, during the previous fiscal year, the last normal year before the COVID-19 pandemic, national sources made up 58% of the Green Bay Packers' total revenue. The rest is typically made up by local sources, mainly through the hosting of fans at home games. So when the pandemic hit and local sources of revenue cratered, the team was buttressed by the money made through the national broadcasting of games, accounting for 83% of total revenue during the first year of COVID. There are not many examples of franchised leagues in the esports industry that have the same 1-2 punch, combining the full utilization of media rights with a high level of revenue sharing, while also managing to not self-sabotage either of those things. In 2018, Activision Blizzard signed a deal with Twitch, selling the exclusive rights to stream the Overwatch League in return for $90 million over 2 years. In 2020, instead of renewing with Twitch, the publisher turned around and signed an exclusivity deal with YouTube to stream Overwatch League, Call of Duty League, and Hearthstone in return for $160 million over 3 years. The team organizations that paid $20 million or sometimes up to $35 million for franchise slots were offered a cut of the league's prize pool and a 50% share of the league's revenues, then split between all teams. While on paper, this is pretty decent, especially for esports, this ended up being a pretty lackluster amount in comparison to the required franchise payments and operating costs. Since the league's inception, it's become more and more accepted that the franchise slots were initially extremely overvalued. When turning towards sponsorship deals to make a buck instead, the teams who bought into the OWL have found ire with ABC's controlling approach. A former team owner spoke on the issue with Bloomberg in an article published last year, saying the amount of money and revenue they expected teams to drive for live events was impossible, says one team owner. They couldn't, for example, form partnerships with companies in brand categories where the larger league already had established deals, like insurance. The owner had rights and everything had to be approved by Blizzard. So what really is the value of your franchise? Insurmountable initial investments topped with restrictions on sponsorships, combined with dwindling viewership, is a recipe for red on a budget sheet. In fact, earlier this year, the majority of teams in OWL came together to begin a collective bargaining process against Activision Blizzard. They aimed to acquire some form of economic relief after expectations for the league continually fell short, putting a damper on any hope for profitability. Riot, as another example of a publisher that runs franchised leagues, doesn't have any kind of widespread exclusivity deal with a major broadcasting platform. In 2020, they signed a 3-year deal with Bilibili, selling the exclusive rights to broadcast international League of Legends events in China. However, this only ends up being a couple tournaments a year in a single market. While China is a very large market, the deal leaves out regular season LPL games, which is China's regional franchise league. Indeed, the English language broadcasts of LPL and Riot's other regional franchise leagues, LCS, LEC, and LCK, are streamed to both Twitch and YouTube. While it was also rumored around the same time that Riot was shopping the rights to its English broadcasts, nothing has since come of it. Even if Riot were to secure a huge bag for its league's media rights, teams would still be missing out. In the case of LCS specifically, teams only get 32.5% of league revenues. But even then, only half of that 16.25% would be distributed equally, while the other half would be distributed based on regular season placement and contribution to viewership. With a lack of media rights deals in place, and over-reliance on sponsorships as the main moneymaker persists. While League of Legends franchise slots were not nearly as overvalued as Overwatch League slots, its revenue sharing is even worse. Perhaps the closest esports analog to the collective pooling and selling of broadcast rights seen in traditional sports is CSGO's ESL Pro League and ESL Pro Tour. Event coordinators ESL and ESEA founded the ESL Pro League in 2015, creating a structured league competition for the top level of CSGO teams in the North American and European regions. Since then, ESL Pro League has expanded to other regions, and in 2019, ESL partnered with event coordinator DreamHack to create the ESL Pro Tour, a more unified circuit structure for CSGO esports globally. In 2020, ESL and the 13 of the top CSGO teams in the world signed the Louvre Agreement, establishing those teams as partners within the ESL Pro League and Pro Tour systems and giving them a share of revenues and profits. This essentially turned ESL CSGO esports endeavors into a franchise competitive structure while still allowing non-partner teams to compete alongside partner teams in Pro Tour events and Pro League qualifiers. Simultaneously, ESL has put the effort in marketing its media rights to broadcasters. In April 2020, ESL signed a deal with Twitch, which gave the streaming platform the exclusive rights to the English language broadcasts of ESL and DreamHack's CSGO, StarCraft 2, and Warcraft 3 major events across 2021 and 2022. Media rights for the ESL Pro Tour have also been sold to traditional broadcasters in many European countries, with Europe being a big market for CSGO. While no exact numbers for these deals have surfaced, they do provide a level of backing for the developing years of ESL's new structure. While undoubtedly a step in the right direction, the Louvre Agreement doesn't guarantee an equal split of revenue between the teams, and in the case of Pro Tour events, nor what could be considered a substantial cut of that revenue. According to the details of the agreement, revenues from Pro League are split with 15% going to ESL, then 25% of the remaining 85% are shared with eligible partner teams. Then, after the deduction of all operating costs, 65% of what remains are shared with the partner teams. Revenues from Pro Tour events are split with 15% going to ESL, then 5% of the remaining 85% are shared with eligible partner teams. Then, after the deduction of all operating costs, 10% of what remains are shared with partner teams. Eligible partner teams being the operative word, as each partner team's individual revenue share is based on the number of events attended, competitive results, and viewership. Needless to say, the repeated shavings and stipulations in ESL's revenue sharing are a far cry from the more egalitarian original AFL deal. But for now, it's working. With no mention of a buy-in price, just a 2/3 majority vote of current members in order to join, nor of outright sponsorship restrictions, teams were primed to earn from the get-go. The Louvre Agreement expanded to 15 partner teams in 2021, and in 2023, it was announced that the terms of the agreement would be extended to 2025. ESL also announced that Pro League 2020, the first year with the Louvre agreement in place, shattered its previous viewership records, undoubtedly boosted by COVID-19 like the rest of the industry. By and large, media rights and revenue sharing are extremely underutilized in the esports industry. And it becomes even more apparent when compared to how prevalent it is in traditional sports. It is the primary driver for nascent leagues and continues to be a significant source of revenue for major leagues to this day. If the esports industry hopes to have any chance at profitability and sustainability, publishers need to fundamentally adjust their approach to how they handle their esports scenes. They can do this by allowing third parties the freedom to develop on their own, or by better incorporating the selling of media rights and sharing of revenue in their own first-party franchised leagues. In regards to the franchise leagues in operation today, it is doubly imperative for them to develop profitable practices with team orgs. As mentioned before, many of the orgs in these leagues also field teams in other games, affecting the whole of the industry. But by looking at the available examples, it becomes clear that the industry practices that are driven by the publishers aren't working, and there's nothing making the publishers go a more egalitarian route that is known to work. It's important to re-emphasize that publishers have no equal at the negotiating table when it comes to pushing for change. Because the game is their intellectual property, the current understanding of US copyright law and how it applies to video games affords publishers a hefty amount of protection of their copyright. However, while it's outside the scope of this presentation, a lot of publishers' actions, especially against third-party esports leagues and broadcasts, has actually never been legally tested. So if a case ends up in the federal court system, or if new legislation like the SBA ends up being written, it could alter our entire understanding of how the industry operates. Right now, the only thing pushing publishers would be the failure of their leagues, and whether that failure is enough to sway them. Until a meaningful change happens, the esports industry will never actually be able to reach any kind of long-term stability for its teams, leagues, or any of the people who work to make these things happen. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. Thank you for watching.